Good afternoon. Welcome to our panel. From coordinated disclosure to cooperative vulnerability research when dealing with critical software stacks. I'm Kelly Jackson Higgins, the executive editor of Dark Reading, and I have a really exciting group of panelists here today. We're very passionate about this topic. With me today on my left is Federico Maggi, who's a senior researcher with Trend Micro. I'm Fedi. Next up is Marina Krotofil, who's an independent researcher who's worked on both the vendor and customer side of the OT space. Hi, Marina. And last but not least, we have Daniel Cuthbert, who works as a global head of cybersecurity research for a major bank. Hello. So, like I said before, these guys are very passionate about this topic. This is something that they wanted to raise. There's been sort of a disconnect between the critical OT software vendors and security researchers who are looking at their products and finding vulnerabilities. Basically, we feel like the system is broken. So we're going to examine some of the issues surrounding this disconnect, what it means for researchers, OT, vendors, bad actors, and even customers. So most importantly, the customers of these products. In the end, we're going to actually have a call to action with some ideas on how to improve this vulnerability disclosure process as it is today. So we're going to get started. I want you to leave some time for questions at the end. So we'll get rolling. So just to sort of level set, when we talk about critical software stacks, this is not your Windows operating system, et cetera. This is more real-time operating systems, embedded code, open source software. So we're talking about the stuff that you may not see right away out there. You're not as visible. So I'm going to start with Federico because we've talked a lot about this. How has vulnerabilities traditionally been handled and disclosed in this space, and sort of what? It usually happens like, obviously, at conferences or someone has a talk, right? They drop a vuln, it can get ugly, there's a report. Yes. Sometimes it's an intermediary involved. Sort of tell us about how it works today.
Yes. Of course, we have all experienced the transition from full disclosure many years ago, then responsible disclosure, and then coordinated disclosure, and here we are now. Usually, there are spontaneous contributions from researchers who find vulnerabilities. Then usually they approach the vendor directly or with the help of a broker. Or there are other sourcing opportunities from bug bounties. Sometimes the researchers also reach out to certs. So there are various ways that critical software can be, vulnerabilities in critical software can be disclosed to the vendor. It happens. As in other software, I would say, there is, however, less interest. That's what I'm feeling in changing things. And that's why we are, I guess, here to discuss this. Right?
Yeah, I think if we look at, say, traditional vulnerabilities, right? So Windows, you mentioned, web servers and so on. Because they're so public-facing, I think vendors are more intrigued or welcoming to actually accept that change. But what we're seeing with the critical stack, because it's not so public-facing, it's like, why? Like, nobody can really easily get to it. There's one of the common misconceptions. And two, nobody really knows about it. So, if the tree falls in a forest type argument really comes into play.
Right. Sometimes you lose track of where that software is used. I think that's the key difficulty here.
It seems like some of those organizations or vendors aren't as kind of well-versed in how security research works anyway, right? There's this cultural divide. They don't really understand what you guys do.
Yeah, I think our industry is still incredibly immature in a way. We talked about this earlier. If we liken it to, say, growing up, security research is in the mid-20s now. We've moved out of home. We can do our own laundry. We've got our own apartment. We're not the crazy teenagers that we were. And I think the world, the software world kind of gets how it works. But there are some old industries that still have never really had the full impact of, finding a bug. And we talked about the psychological aspect. I feel like a lot of the times when I've reported bugs, companies have seen it as a massive insult, as a threat. Whereas in reality, if I was doing it from a criminal perspective, I'm not going to report the bug to you. I'm going to exploit it and make lots of money in Dogecoin or whatever. Right? So I think there's still a lot of understanding about what people do when it comes from a security research vulnerability side of things.
This can go south pretty badly, right? I mean, like, what are some examples? Marina, I don't know if you have some ideas of some things that really, like, critical software vulnerabilities that can really cause big problems that are, like, dangerous, that can happen if they're not handled well.
Absolutely, and this is, if I would put a hat on the asset owner, the problem which like the issues which asset owner is observing is that the vulnerability will be reported, maybe announced on the Black Hat via the talk, or there will be an advisory, and there will be very little information what that vulnerability means for the asset owner in terms of where the attacker needs to be in order to be able to exploit this vulnerability. So how do I understand, how do I evaluate risk to my asset, whether this vulnerability is exploitable or not at all? And then if for example, if I evaluate that there is this exploitability, like my asset is exposed, then how it can be weaponized, what exactly the attacker can do, what exploit can be written, and only then I can evaluate like, what risk does it pose to me? And unfortunately, because the vendors are typically not working with the researchers, so the vendors also don't understand themselves what is the impact on this vulnerability, because there is this discrepancy in this communication. As a result, I cannot be, as an asset owner, I cannot be informed what does it mean to me. Typically, the advisory will be published with the words like, the impact of this vulnerability depends on the architecture of individual organization. Well, thanks, that's not helpful. So as a result, like if I would be owner of these critical assets where there is this critical vulnerabilities, I really would like researchers and the vendor talking together. I would like that they listen and understand better from the researcher, like how this vulnerability can be specifically utilized for launching an attack, how it can be used. And then how can they help me to understand what is the best way to mitigate it? Because I might not be able to patch to the next year. So what is the alternative or compensating security control so that I could prevent or mitigate this vulnerability? And again, this only can be done if this combo of researcher and vendor are working together, and then vendor hopefully works with me. And this is, unfortunately, the whole process of how this vulnerabilities is disclosed, including this crazy CVSS, which is not helpful to the asset owners.
There is a lot of distance, so, I mean, between researchers and vendors already. I can only imagine when asset owner, because we're talking about libraries probably, something that will be embedded into an operating system, that will be embedded into a larger product, a router, an industrial router. So it's almost impossible to keep track of all of this, right? We mentioned quickly this morning about the bill of material approach to tracking this kind of linkage between critical libraries and their usage, which is, I think, also the missing links create a vulnerability itself.
Yep.
Think, for example, of a complete, very outdated software like never maintained. I don't know if any of you have seen the XKCD comic on critical software stack, where there is a tiny brick that keeps the entire infrastructure all up, and that tiny bit is maintained tirelessly by some random people in Nebraska. That's what the drawing says. And that's, in some cases, the fact that a maintainer stops working on that critical brick creates a vulnerability itself. Even if the software is not vulnerable, but the fact that it is not maintained anymore, there's no guarantee that someone will update it in case something is found in the future, is a vulnerability. And there is already something that we can do in this direction, because the common weaknesses enumeration has one specific entry to track this: the presence of an outdated library into another software, irrespective of that software being vulnerable or not, is a weakness.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I mean, so yesterday we heard news that Busybox has got 14 vulnerabilities.
Oh, yes.
I mean, everybody uses Busybox, right? Even without you knowing it. And often, whenever I've done embedded stuff, you use Busybox and you forget about it.
Yeah.
And, it goes into the point, like curl. Curl's another perfect example. I think, find me a person on the internet today that hasn't used curl or doesn't use curl. Curl's developed by one person. And it's quite scary when you realize, like, especially with embedded systems, how many use curl. If you took curl away, I'd fathom that half the internet would disappear. We'd forget the Facebook outage. Just take curl out, we have a problem. So yeah, that CWE thing is a really valid point.
So you guys have had different experiences with vendors over the years with your research. Can you share some examples of just like the challenges you have when you do disclose? Like what can go wrong? Like specifically, do you have any you could share with us, Fedi, from your?
I think the worst case is that the vendor doesn't care, not even to respond. Unfortunately, this has happened. We've seen the complete opposite this morning in a talk where after, what was it, 48 hours, there was a patch out in the Microsoft Azure. So that was the exactly opposite of what can happen in critical software that is not popular, does not enjoy the popularity, the visible popularity, I would say, because it's much more pervasive if you want. It's just not visible. So what can happen is that vendors don't respond, even to multiple times of multiple attempts to contact them. This has happened recently. We've been working with a vendor. You will see, for those who are joining my session tomorrow, we'll see that there is one vendor that produces this library that is used to control very critical system up to missiles, aircraft, spacecraft. And one of these vendors never replied. We tried multiple times through brokers, directly, through certs, not even an answer, right? This, I think, is the worst case because they pretend vulnerabilities are not there. So they don't get a CVE, they don't get any public tracking, right? But the vulnerabilities are there. And I think it's not the only case. We spoke this morning about pen testing engagements, right? Also, that's a very good source of collaboration, vulnerabilities, and so on. But how much of that is visible to the public?
Not much. I mean, my experience of bugs, I took a break after 10 years where I was threatened with legal action. That was the normal thing when you reported a bug. In some cases, you get arrested. So you stop reporting vols. You find some very big tech giants who are incredibly arrogant. I'm using that word, arrogance. It's that I don't want a CVE associated because my product is not insecure. Right? And the worst thing I think, and this is going to be controversial, that's happened to the security industry is marketing and PR getting involved. Because it's all about damage limitation and how much can we save face.
Or legal.
Or legal. Well, nobody ever benefits if legal get involved.
Yeah.
But, so there's always that pressure of, all right, I'm not looking to exploit something for criminal. If that was my job, I wouldn't be reporting the vulnerability to you.
Yeah.
I would hurt you and make money from it.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of times if PR, marketing, or legal get involved, that's when the barriers come up and it just becomes really hard where, I gave up for 10 years. I'm like, why am I doing this? I'm not getting a reward. This was pre-bug bounties. I'm giving away terrible business person bugs that could have been sold for a lot of money. And how many researchers have been through this? It's a common theme with the industry where we're just kind of fed up in a way.
Yeah, and if I will just, I'm a researcher myself and I'm presenting a gigantic novel attack surface tomorrow at the talk. But again, then if I will take the asset owner position that, yes, unfortunately, because it's very well understood that industry is not really collaborating with the researchers and many organizations, of course, are actually forced to carry the cost of that pen test on themselves. So whenever you deploy new type of devices or software, this cost of performing pen test of those is put on you. And then unfortunately, as Federico has mentioned, everything what is found in that pen test, you may or may not report to the vendor, but vendor is not obliged to fix it. So that whatever will be found will be known only to that specific company, and they might figure out the compensation security controls. Everybody else remains vulnerable, and that is, of course, as such a problem which needs to be fixed, I believe. But also, so for example, this attack surface, which we'll be presenting tomorrow, the vendor just says, yeah, great, fantastic, good work. Vendors just should apply, asset owners should just apply defense in depth. It's just like, what does it even mean? And secondly, it's just such a philosophical discussion what it means, because depending where the asset is located and so on in the architecture, but also they did not even inform, they did not create any advisories, they did not inform any of their customers. So customers does not even aware of this gigantic novel attack surface. They just decided not to do so. And to us, they just responded with the defense in depth. So yeah, unfortunately, these responses to disclosures is still a gigantic problem which really need to be worked on. And again, the best people, of course, I would here agree with Federico that the best people in a position to explain the potential impact and implications of these attack surfaces are those who found this vulnerability or attack surface.
Is the underlying problem still the sort of gap between, developers' perspective versus security people's perspective? We talk a lot about DevSecOps and SDL, but there's still that cultural, difference. We see it all the time. Is that part of the underlying issue here with these vendors? As some of these folks are coming up from the software-only perspective, and they just don't quite understand the security implications or what you do, or?
Yeah, I think we're still very siloed. The shifting left movement, or SDLC, whatever they want to call it, this period is still quite new in the security world, right? But if you look in the embedded space and everything else, it's still very, you have your risk people, you have your software, you have your devs, you have your, and they don't really talk to each other. And I think this is, in my experience, when you're reporting bugs like this, it becomes very hard, because if you report a vulnerability, in my experience, rarely are you reporting it to somebody close to that vulnerability. So they're already detached from what's happening, and I think that just makes matters hard. I mean, you two might have a different approach.
Well, I mean, I think I found the best way to speak with engineers of a specific product about security is in terms of testing. They know, testing is a word that resonates very well in their mind, because they are engineers, they're used to create test cases and so on. So when I start, I've tried this recently to see if things can be improved. And instead of just going to the vendor once I'm done with the findings, I try to engage with them earlier, right? Say, can you please help me understand your product? Because, I'm a researcher. I'm willing to help you. I'm willing to find vulnerabilities. I will be happy because I will have my publications. Marketing will be happy because they can, of course, get visibility. You will have to be happy because you will have bugs fixed, bugs that you wouldn't be aware otherwise, right? So can we start talking earlier, right? We try to find a common language, and once we found this language, I tell you what are my needs, and you tell me, oh, that part of the library very deep down that I wrote 10 years ago, but it's still there, probably might have some issues. So you want to go and look there, right? So sort of a glass box approach, instead of treating us as adversaries. And on the other hand, we should stop, I think, treating vendors as black boxes.
Yep. My best case of vulnerabilities we found recently, we tried a new thing. We looked at the psychology of working with people. I don't like vulnerability brokers. It reminds me of an old mafia skit where some dude named Tony in a big suit walks up to a vendor and says, he found something wrong with your product, what are you going to do about it? Naturally, vendors don't like this. We try to fit into a sprint. So we fitted into a 4-week dev sprint where we were embedded with everybody building this feature in this product. And it was phenomenal. Like, we found a lot of vols, but because we had access to the people writing the code, we had access to the Git repo, we could understand the flow that they were doing. And if we found something we weren't sure, we could speak to that engineer or developer who was building it. And we just found so many bugs that way. And there wasn't that anger that I think that we have, like Federico said, coming at the end of it, the waterfall method of, hey, you've built your, basically calling your baby ugly. And that's what vulnerability research is, right? It's saying your child is ugly. I'm a plastic surgeon, I can make it look better, right? And I think that's what we need to move away from, to say, I don't know how we do it with the child and ugliness, but you see where I'm going.
This is, I kind of have in that direction, but another analogy is that, yes, it should become normalized for vendors to speak about, yes, it's natural that you will have attack surface. It's just natural. Nobody can avoid it.
Embrace it, yes.
Yes, and it has to be normalized to speak about it and admitting it. It's just like, like in the past, it was not okay to talk about, for example, mental issues. Right now, we have open society, and it is okay to admit mental struggles. And it's kind of, you need to go into that mindset that it's okay to speak. And I think the change has started already at a level of disclosing breaches. In the past, no organization would ever come on stage. Right now, it became almost fashionable. And, it started with one CISO who came on stage and said, hey, I've had a breach. Then after that, every CISO wanted to talk on the stage because it's now started looking positive light. Yep. So it's just a kind of really changing that mindset that if the vendor finally understand that nobody will be criticizing and looking through the negative, let's say, light on you, then we will probably have a much open conversation.
But you say that, and you know, Black Hat 2 years ago, I'm very much into car hacking. If you want critical safety, that's a closed industry, the car world. There are no such things as software bugs in cars, according to car manufacturers, which is weird because when you look at cars, they're just lots of embedded computers that have never been updated ever. When last did you patch your car, right? It doesn't happen. But what was interesting was a team from China found a serious amount of vulnerabilities in BMW, and BMW joined them in the talk. And it was a phenomenal talk because it was, hey, all right, so you found these vulnerabilities in the head unit, but actually, here's how we had to go through patching. And do you know how you patch cars over the air whilst they're driving around? Like, a lot of people are like, damn, I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah.
So that was fascinating because that was a big corporation finally going, our cars were vulnerable. And there are some in the industry, in the enterprise world, who I deem critical security, who to date still don't ever acknowledge vulnerabilities. It's the old Marianne Oracle unbreakable. You know, and that turned out really well for Oracle with Dave tearing Oracle apart every day. We're still kind of there with a lot of the critical safety where it's almost seen as really bad if you admit weakness. When, let's be honest, like we are terrible at writing secure code. We just are, right?
So there's an incentive missing for the vendors then, sort of, right? I mean, how do you convince them? I mean, what you're saying makes sense, but what incentive do you give them to put themselves out there, which is what it feels like for some of them, right?
Yes.
What can you do to make that more of a appealing process for them?
Yeah.
Marija, she did an amazing keynote this morning, and it's something that has really resonated with me. Like, when we go and buy a car, I don't expect it to blow up. When I buy a phone charger and plug it to the wall, it has the kite mark. I know I'm not going to get shocked. We need something like that for critical software and hardware stacks, where a vendor has to adhere to that. And I can't believe I'm here talking about regulation and compliance, because that's really weird.
We're going there.
But at the end of the day, you know, there's a talk by Mandiant later on, VPNs. During COVID, we relied heavily on VPNs. That industry is awful. It's 1990s. It uses CGI for crying out loud. But they are sold as secure devices that people put their trust in them and hope they're not going to get shocked. And, well, everybody who owned a VPN got owned by everybody last year. So it's like, maybe we do need finally regulation that says to a vendor, you can't keep on selling this crap and hope that it isn't going to get attacked, because people are getting attacked now.
Yes, and sometimes there are also it's researchers, like I talk about myself because most of the time researchers work for security corporations, which also offer products, right, to secure their system. So I'm sometimes in a difficult position because on the one end, I would like to approach a software vendor and say, hey, I would like to work with you, find vulnerabilities in your products, and then when we're done, we disclose a joint report where we both say that what we found and so on in a positive spin, right? That's beneficial if you want from the one end. On the other end, I also understand my employer as well as other large security corporations that do say, okay, but well, we already are selling products to this vendor, right? Why do you want to approach them and tell them that we want to find more problems while we are supposed to fix them? So vulnerability research is not yet perceived as something that can be put in a positive spin overall from a psychological point of view, from a market point of view, from an incentive point of view. So I think we are in a moment where the coordinated disclosure has been saturated, I think. I think we should start using another term. That's why in the title of this panel there is a cooperative disclosure, to give it a more positive spin around this.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about the positivity angle. Like, I know that if I see on a vendor's website, not necessarily CVEs, because I think there's been a race to just get CVEs at the moment, and you're not a security researcher if you don't have CVEs. Well, I'm not a security researcher. A lot of my bugs have never been made public because I was under NDA, right? But I think if a product owner was showcasing, hey, we had an amazing team tear apart our product, and they found these bugs, and we fixed these bugs within X amount of time.
Yeah.
Well, me as a buyer will go, oh, wow, they're quite mature.
Yeah.
Like, they get it. They're not seeing it as a thing. And maybe That's where we can take marketing out of the bad space they're in at the moment and get marketing to do the good things, to make it seem like vuln research is actually a very positive thing, not just this negative thing that I think vuln research has at the moment. We're hackers, basically. We're finding bugs and calling kids ugly, and it's not helping.
Dana, you just touched on the next thing I want to ask you guys about. Marina, maybe you can address this. From the customer perspective, if you have the researcher and the vendor working together more closely, how does that play out for the customer? A lot of times, all these customers aren't even patching, right? When they get a new update to some of these OT products, don't necessarily automatically get patched. So what are the advantages and importance from the customer perspective here with this relationship being more cooperative?
Yeah, so I think I already kind of touched it earlier, is that, even software bill of materials, it will only tell me that not only this box is vulnerable, but apparently this library is used also in that box, in that box, in that box. And again, I might not be necessarily able to patch because I cannot stop production, but I also need to evaluate what is the risk. Do I need to patch at all? Because if the risk is very negligible to my specific organization, then for me, it's much more costly to patch because, it's very complicated process to patch something in a real organization. You need to have people, it's planning and everything. So, but without proper information about what that specific vulnerability means to me, how it can be exploited, what its potential impact, where the attacker is being, all of that things, I cannot make all of these decisions. I'm just sitting there, and probably in reality, I will not probably patch. I will decide not to patch. No. And then me as an asset owner, if something happens, the responsibility will be on me because oh, you did not patch. You're so stupid. You're not patching. Do you know how it costs to patch? It's extremely expensive. And this information is missing. And I think with Daniel, we've been talking about also blue team bug bounty.
Oh, yes,
I really would like, for example, I would appreciate if vendor maybe even pay a little bit of money to the researcher. And can you please write an accommodating white paper how this vulnerability can be exploited? Because depending where the asset is also located, is it on the perimeter, is it deep in the network, which functions it carries out, and so on. Depending where the asset is located, it can be exposed or not exposed, it can be exploited in different ways, and then how exactly this vulnerability is weaponizable and what that tasks or activities the attacker can carry out. So I need that information so that I could make informed decisions. How do I mitigate? And then do I patch or do I use maybe compensating security controls? Maybe there could be created some rules which I need to monitor on the network. Again, that information can be only provided by the researchers. And this is where, and I think, of course, vendors don't have incentives for any of this. Unfortunately, I've been thinking about your question. They don't. I don't see why they would be interested unless we create a pressure on the vendors, like both researchers, maybe governments, legislation, regulation, and asset owners create more pressure that, no, you must do that. It's your responsibility. It's similarly with the medication. You have to write side effects.
Yeah. I think the blue bounty thing is, we talked about it earlier, and I would love that. We are at Black Hat, we're on the review board. Black Hat's always very offensive driven. But the reality is making stuff secure is much harder than offensive, and that's 20 years of breaking in stuff. And you could fight me about that for every day. We've got bug bounties. We've got all these amazing programs where people go and do the offensive stuff. What we need is a blue bounty where we say, hey, a vendor comes out and says, right, you found a vulnerability in X, right? 1, we do not have the capability to write the patch. 2, maybe we need help doing secure nginx configs. Or 3, help us, secure our K8 cluster. It would be quite cool to have that kind of initiative where you have people with defensive experience and vendors say, right, they're in a hiring crisis like everybody else. Maybe they can't patch because that team doesn't exist. They say, right, we've got 10,000 euros, help us patch this. And they take the work that Federico has done. I think we almost need that now. Defense has got to be made a lot sexier. And it's weird that I love the Black Hat stuff. I love popping shells and shit like everybody else. But at the same time, the defensive stuff, I don't want my kids to be impacted by lame-ass software that wasn't patched because A, it was too hard, or B, they just didn't have the capability. So maybe we need to kind of make it incentivized to say, you will earn money writing patches. Doesn't sound as cool as getting shells, but you probably make more money looking at the amount of bugs that are out there. So
I would say that it's also beneficial for researchers because you might as well get to more vulnerabilities because working with a vendor, I think, is the best way to educate ourselves about what the product is about, how it works, the internals, what is a design that has been put down in the whiteboard, and why that piece of code is there. It takes time for researchers to learn the language, not the programming language, but the libraries and the low-level components that are part of a software. It takes a lot of time to get familiar with that. So,
and I think also if we will not start having this closer collaboration between researchers and vendors, the learnings will never start accumulating, and we will keep producing the same software with the same architectural or, let's say, design flaws. The learnings will never be accumulated.
Yeah, so maybe we need, instead of just a wall of fame for vulnerability researchers, we also need a global wall of fame for vendors who are willing to be collaborative in this way, right?
So my last...
Something like that. Just something that came up.
Well, my last company, we did a lot of offensive pen testing, SenseMost. We changed our reports where, we've all been through a pen test where you struggle to find vulnerabilities, right? And it's that Friday and you're literally going, SSL bit not set on the cookie. Yep, that's going in. I know it's lame, but I've got to have a report. We decided, well, let's actually flip that and let's report on the positive things that they were doing. Like, man, you really made my life miserable because of X, or your architecture was really good. That Hall of Fame would be really cool. Like a vendor, a traditional vendor, I don't know.
I mean, take the B&W example that you brought up before, right? Yeah. The vendor on stage with the researcher, explaining to the world what was the issue, how they found it, how they fixed it. Yep. I think that's, everyone's happy here.
So you've thrown out some great ideas. Where do we go from here? Like, what's the next step, the call to action here to get there?
I think the blue bounty thing is something I'd like to explore.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know how, but I think maybe it's time. And then also kind of working together to showcase how this could work. Pick some vendors and say, right, these are the journeys that we've been on with them. And I'm going to go away and speak with some of the vendors that we've been doing with this and say, listen, do you want to go public? And some of these are notoriously shy. I mean, I come from enterprise. There's no bugs in enterprise. It's a unicorn, amazing world, right? Nobody ever attacks anything. But if I can convince them to say, hey, let's go public about this, maybe others will follow.
Yeah, and when we reach the critical mass, more of the vendors will join because they will see the positive effect of that.
Yep.
Got to get the first ones to go, though.
Yeah, usually you need client zero to bootstrap a company, then you need,
you're having the vendor be joining.
I mean, is there an example
I am
right now?
one of the lucky researchers having another B&W example on stage tomorrow with me, which is amazing, I think.
So let's use them. There's our
I was
first
going to say, just one to start with. That could be.
There's our first one.
Could be them, and I think they are pretty receptive in this kind of space. They want to learn. That was our first answer that we got from them. We told them, we're willing to do this assessment. We want to go public in X months because that's what we do usually. Are you interested or not? We told them most of the vendors that we wanted to assess. We engaged with them, and only 1/2, but the other one then didn't have the resources, so they decided to say no. I cannot do this. 1 out of 6 was really our star, I would say.
Cool. What about, you just mentioned, if they don't have, I was thinking this too, some of these like
resources.
Small library, the resources, right? The open source groups.
The URL.
How do you help them do this? I mean, that's...
It's interesting that there's a big move at the moment. I know Google's looking at it, GitHub's looking at it, with the open source libraries. I mean, GitHub, I've become a big fan of GitHub. I know when they're acquired, all the tinfoil hats like, oh, they're going to ruin it. But reality is, GitHub is where the world's software lives, and they've decided to use that force. You've got CodeQL, which is a phenomenal tool to find bugs, and it's available to everybody with open source projects. So you now have the entry to barrier. Traditionally before, if you wanted to do static analysis tools, they were expensive. Yeah. So open source projects would never do it. Yeah. So they weren't looking for bugs. Well, with GitHub, you can now do it for free. So it's almost like, you need these big tech giants to say, we will depend on this anyway. We can't have the incident where you've got the world using one piece of software like curl, written by one person, maintained one. Well, it's not fair anymore. Like, it's a recipe for disaster. Mm.
Well, I think you guys brought up some great reality checks of what's happening and some really good ideas. It'd be great to see the industry kind of move it forward. I think everyone likes the idea of cooperative security research. It also helps you get ahead of the bad guys, ideally, right? If you're working together.
You're just assuming that they are not smarter than us, right? It is not a good approach.
Not going to happen. So we wanted to leave 5 minutes for questions from the audience. There are a couple of microphones in the very back, one in that row, one in that row. If anybody would like to step up to a microphone, I know Federico and Marina and Daniel will be happy to answer your questions.
Yes. I think there's a microphone.
Do you mind going to the microphone, because we won't be able to
for
hear
the
you
recording mainly.
Thank you.
So, Dominic, I write for the Register and various people. I've been coming to security conferences since the late Bronze Age, and people have been telling me that we ought to all cooperate. About since the Bronze Age. Never happens. Doesn't really happen at all. It's something people like yourselves say, never ever happens. Is the only way for governments to get involved, like they do for things like healthcare? And so if you don't, in fact, is not healthcare the best model to go for?
It's a good moment, yeah.
A big stick and heavy litigation until people actually do the right thing.
I'm with you, and I agree that we've been talking about cooperative disclosure for a while. I think we all need to be beaten so hard by a fish to realize that something's not right. And I feel like at the moment, the ransomware groups are doing that job. Ransomware is nothing but an IT hygiene problem. Right? We all knew that there were problems before, but ransomware is so popular now, and you make a lot of money doing it, and people are finally talking about it. You know, you've got State Department going, we need to secure the supply chain. We need to fix all this. So maybe you're right. Maybe it is time, and again, I'm calling for regulation. It's really weird, for them to come in and say, listen, enough's enough. And the UK is doing that. So I'm involved with DCMS, where you've got the secure by design or secure by default standard, which is trying to force manufacturers to get better. But maybe we just need a bigger stick, a big fish.
Software bill of materials becoming official in the USA.
Yeah.
So definitely some changes are happening on the official level.
You have another question?
Hi. You have talked about, liability and possibly, regulation and so on, which sometimes scares me a bit because I'm afraid we will have yet another law that will make consultants richer and fatter, but not necessarily system more secure. I'm surprised I haven't heard anything about the push that could come from the consumer, the customers themselves. What about customers' organization? How comes none of those say, you want to sell me something, so show me that you have done proper, diligence and you have really paid a professional organization who really will check your stuff independently. It seems to me that we are in this world where we would have an entertainment park that would open and it would say, whoever wants to come to fix and verify that we have built this stuff right, then we will give them a little bounty, right? I mean, this is insane. This is insane. The customers, the people would never go to this entertainment park. How comes people just are happy buying stuff that they know is probably not good?
I think that's a big problem with the industry today, is that marketing is incredibly powerful. There's no other way around it. We have boxes that stop 0 days. The big bugbear of mine for a long time, a blinky blue light that fixes stuff, and nobody's got the skills, the time, or the capability to actually question that vendor. Halvar Flake did an amazing keynote in Singapore for Black Hat a couple of years ago, where he talked about, if customers all gang together to start forcing vendors to get better, we would see change. But the reality is customers aren't doing that. Because I think and there's probably a psychological study as to why, but I think a lot of people under pressure, they just say, well, it's an RSA, so it's a good product, it must be good, so we'll get it.
Yeah, I mean, the customers usually come into play when it's consumer technology. Consumers come into play when it's consumer technology like a phone. If I know that a phone is manufactured by a company that has been in the news many times for not fixing security bugs, then maybe I choose over another phone, right? That's the easy example. But when we're talking about critical software, how do you get the consumer even know that the Kennedy Space Station is launching a rocket into space that is using a TCP/IP library that hasn't been patched for years?
But
I mean, how could the customers have a voice here?
yes, and then also, I mean, in reality, when you start selecting either product, like let's say devices or software, you start with marketing research, there are several candidates. There will be only very few which fits your requirements and build, because you cannot go with small, you need to only go with large, blah, blah, blah. So you are always limited to a number of vendors with whom you can go. And sometimes because of the legacy, whatever, there are multiple reasons which will force you to just have a pool of 1, 2, 3 suitable vendors. And then all of them will have issues. You will perform pen tests, there will be issues. And then you will address, they say, yeah, we are not going to fix. And then what? You have no choice but procure that anyway. You have no choice. And that is the problem. Unless there will be regulatory governmental regulations which force vendor to do something. As a customer, you don't have really pressure, because whether you want it or not, you have very limited, in reality, this is pragmatical, what I'm just saying right now. You will have a very, very small pool of what you can choose to work with. And if they will refuse to fix, you will be living with it. You will just take it.
Yeah.
Well, we're at the top of the end of the panel session time frame. So anybody else have a question? We have time for one more. Well, as you can see, there's a lot still to be ironed out, but we got some great, I think, thoughts out here and ideas. And thank you all so much for your time today. I want to thank the panel, Federico,
We got one more.
Marina. Oh, I have one more question. Sorry, I didn't see you.
Oh.
Mic's off.
I think the mic went off.
Yeah, they enforce
They
it.
do.
So just a quick counterexample. I mean, we knew about DNSSEC for a long, long time, and it was never deployed. And it only got deployed when Bill Moen actually forces the various organizations in the US to say, whenever you want to buy something now in the future, it has to have DNSSEC enabled.
Yep.
And supported. And it's only because from a procurement point of view, the customers made it mandatory, then the companies started supporting it. And because it was there, then people started deploying it.
That's a
So I think
national
customers,
regulation.
it's all about money. Customers
Yeah.
and customers' organizations, not each individual customer, but customer organization have the capability to make pressure on some of the vendors.
I agree. So I'm the co-author of the OWASP ASVS standard. It's a standard for application security. It's relatively old now. And we've got a way of pushing vendors and asking customers to push vendors to say, right, if you're buying an application, is it ASVS level 2? What kind of testing have you done for it? And we have seen some customers get quite antsy. The problem is procurement. Procurement is you can pick 3 products, but you're going to pick the cheapest one, right? That's the nature of, especially in this space. We don't have the luxury, as Marina said, there's not hundreds of vendors. There's normally 2 or 3, and the cheapest will always probably win. And I think that's the barrier you've got to come through. But if you had a standard of such that says, right, those 2 vendors have to build towards a standard, a kite mark as such.
Yeah.
So at least the customer knows, well, he's a little bit cheaper or she's a little bit cheaper, but they're both built to the kite mark. So, okay, at least I'm not going to get shocked. We're not even there at the moment. It's still there's alpha quality code that uses a library that somebody forgot about 15 years ago. But hey, they'll pay millions for it. Like, who's going to check? But I agree, we do need more pressure from customers to say, I don't want to get electrocuted anymore. Can you prove you've actually done the right job?
Okay, we're going to leave it right there on electrocution.
That's fine. Happy days.
Thank you again, Federico, Marina,
you.
and Daniel, for a great conversation. And thank you all for your patience and for being here with us.